Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you. Thanks so much for coming. So we're going to talk about the music for Bloodborne. And my name is Peter, and I was one of the music producers on this project. And to my right, this is Penka, and this is Jim. And both Penka and Jim did the orchestration for both the main game and the DLC. So they will talk about the specifics of the music, but I thought what I might be able to do for you, and I hope it's interesting for you, is to do a little bit of a behind-the-scenes discussion to let you know how this project wound up coming to be. And I'll let you know about the team that was assembled to realize Hidetaka Miyazaki's vision for the score. So ultimately, this was a team of 6 composers writing 130 minutes of music, spanned 3 continents, was 2.5 years in the making, and involved collaborations between 5 separate Sony campuses. I just thought those were impressive statistics because, this became a big production, but it didn't start out that way. So initially, this project started out as discussions between From Software and the Japan studio. And at this point, our colleagues in Japan sat down with Miyazaki-san and the From Software staff composers to discuss their thoughts about the score. So this is my colleague in Japan. I'm very fond of him. This is Kei, and he's the audio director for Japan Studio. So he initially sat down with the folks from Software, Miyazaki, and asked if they had any goals for the score. So unfortunately, Kei couldn't be here. He had to take a flight back to Japan, but he had this to say. Since From Software had their own in-house composers, naturally we could have just used them. But since this was a new challenge for us, with a new game for the new PS4 hardware, their composers thought that they needed something new and different to work with, especially when it came to music that would match the game's atmosphere and the type of musical expressions they wanted to aim for, and a quality that could be accepted worldwide, which was an important point. So Kei continues, says, Miyazaki-san gathered some video material to give us an idea of what the kind of music he wanted, and the music that he brought to them was from this album. This is City of the Fallen. And this was composed by an American composer that you might know, Ryan Ammon. And Ryan had done the music for the Sony film Elysium, of which he collaborated with Penka on that. So when Miyazaki-san had presented this material to Kei and our folks, our colleagues in Japan, they reached out to the director of our music studio here in America, and that's Chuck Dowd. And they were wondering if we could get in touch with Ryan. Now, it's funny how things work out, because as luck would have it, Ryan, we were in L.A. at the time. It was myself and Chuck, and Ryan happened to be in L.A. as well. And literally just swung by our Sony campus in Los Angeles, and we started to talk and discuss the project. And Ryan was fantastic. He's a brilliant composer, and he was really excited to get involved in the project. So initially, our task was to create the music for a trailer that was going to be the debut trailer for Bloodborne at E3. And what we did as the American team is that we provided creative direction to Ryan, and the Japan studio facilitated communication between their music team and From Software. Now, I bring this story up today because, to me, I feel like there is, for those of you who may not have a window into this process, that it's a really compelling story. Because what's happened with Ryan is that he's done a self-published trailer record that he distributed on iTunes, and I'm sure, other methods of distribution. And this wound up weaving its way all the way back to, and I'm going to get into more details about the story as it's told to me, some fans of the Dark Souls series, which paired this music up with some footage from Dark Souls, and then that's what was presented to Miyazaki-san. And that's what really grabbed him. So the point here, folks, is that, the world is listening. And if any of you have felt, as I have felt in the past as a former composer and now producer, thinking, how do I meet the right people? How do I get the projects that I would really like to be working on? I would give you this advice, having had a window now into this process. Best thing to do is focus on the music. Just do some great work, as I'm sure you all do. Put it out there, because folks really are listening. And I think now, in the world that we have with the types of communication tools, now more than ever. So I felt some despair in the past, thinking, how do I move forward here? That really is the way to do it. And I encourage you all, just focus on your art for the composers that are here in the room. It will get heard, I promise you. All right, moving on, back to Bloodborne. And ultimately, what wound up happening with the score is that it was written by 3 in-house Japanese composers from software, and they're absolutely brilliant. And we had 3 American composers that we wound up recommending and contributing. So the challenge for us at this point was, with 6 composers, how do we achieve a consistent sound? So, and before that is, sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. What we had to do first was we had to define the sound. What was going to be something that was going to be, it was going to be the elements that really captured what Bloodborne was about. So we had some further discussions with our colleagues in Japan Studio and from software, and we talked to them, of course, of what they wanted to achieve with the score. Then we did a little bit of research, and what we wound up doing was to create something that we call a style guide. And what this is a research project that we do. We find other scores that have been produced that we think have elements that help to define the sound that the creative team is looking to achieve. And then we present that, and then we talk about it and figure out, well, what are the elements that we feel are going to work for Bloodborne, and maybe what elements are not applicable to that. We wound up presenting in the end maybe about 20 scores that we found tracks from sort of various scores that we thought really helped define the sound. We had a lot of help with that, particularly from Daniel Schweiger from the Formosa Group, who's in LA, happens to be Penka's husband. But he's an absolutely brilliant guy, and of course our own in-house Sony team. We do this kind of work as well. So, the Gothic Victorian sound. This was something that was very interesting to me, because what we found is that people generally, and by people I think us, sort of collectively, associate this Victorian sound as being featured solo strings and string quartet, primarily. And what was interesting to me is that if you do the research, the historical research, that actually has nothing to do with what the music that was popular in that era in Europe in the Victorian time. So it's interesting how our perceptions change over time. For the Gothic part, we asked the composers to integrate a quasi-classical approach to the compositions. And I just listed here some of the main elements of the orchestra and other musical elements that we use that eventually made up what the Victorian sound is. Excuse me, I'm getting dry. Okay, next was how are we going to achieve a consistent sound with 6 composers? So this was an idea that we brought to our colleagues and brought to From Software, and I'm very proud to say that in the end we felt that this was really successful. And what we did was we defined what the primary orchestral lineup was going to be for the musicians. You can see it up here. And what we asked the composers to do is just compose the music with this template in mind. Now, initially, I have to say this was met with a little bit of resistance because, the conventional wisdom, at least amongst some of the composers, was, well, I want to have all the colors that are available to me in the orchestra. And what we pointed out is that, well, it doesn't necessarily work the same with artwork, right? What you do, or colors for a game. Sometimes you reduce that to a palette that really applies to the game, and we can do that with the music as well. So as that point was presented, I have to say it was embraced by all of the composers, and the net result of that is that when you listen to the Bloodborne score, it doesn't sound wildly different from track to track, although we have a lot of different composers there. So this worked for us. Here's a couple of pictures of the recording. We did quite a lot of the recording at Air Studios in London. And you can see there's the string and brass line up there, and we did the choir separately. Here's something similar at Abbey Road. We wound up recording there as well. Excellent facilities to record. Okay, I'm going to bring up Penka right now. She's going to talk, give an analysis of some of the music. So is Jim, and then I'll come back at the end and talk a little bit about how the production continued.
Good morning again. So I will discuss the style, form, harmony, and orchestration of the score. So we know Bloodborne follows the hunter through the fictional, decrepit Gothic city of Yharnam. Its inhabitants have been afflicted with a blood-borne disease like a plague that turns them into hideous monsters. The overall aesthetics, as Pete pointed out, is a Victorian Gothic horror music for mutant monsters in the scoring traditions of Dracula. All of us are familiar with the Dracula vernacular, and that was our style guide. How is the music used in gameplay? So music plays during the downloading of the game. The track is called on the soundtrack The Night Unfurls, and if you stay on the title screen a little bit longer, also the E3 trailer will play. It's titled Omen. I'll take a close look just in a moment. Music also plays during the boss battles. It is always fast, intense, very dramatic, and relentless. Music is also heard in the hub, where the player rests and stocks up on weapons. It's titled The Hunter's Dream, composed by Ryan Ammon. The Hunter's Dream is a dark and contemplative piece featuring the solo viola. The viola was selected to express the subdued feelings in the hub. Many online score reviewers said solo cello, but actually it's viola, not cello. Viola has a different tone. It's not as expressive. It's more nasal. And it's also, the viola is more subdued. It's not as rich and beefy as the cello. And again, that was a very purposeful choice. And the haunting soloists add a special quality to the score and make it a distinctive characteristic of the music. I would like to play an excerpt from the track called Hunter's Dream, which we hear when we're in the hub. The music for the hub. I wanted to mention that many level campaigns are mostly without background music, but with creepy and evocative sound design instead. This contrast between the sound design for walkthroughs and intense music for the boss battles creates an atmosphere of dread and fear. When the silence breaks with an ominous chant or pounding rhythm, you know you're in a boss battle. This was a very specific, creative, and aesthetical choice made by the game makers. This was not random or not, this was an aesthetical choice. The orchestral music employs a variety of what we call extended orchestral techniques, also known as orchestral sound effects, which are inspired by 20th century modernism. I'm going to mention a number of names of modernist composers. For instance, Ligeti, the composer of a fantastic variety of music, but he's mostly known as the composer of the choral music used in 2001 Space Odyssey. If you remember the monolith on the moon cue, that's what Ligeti sounds like. Also, Expressionism. Expressionism is early 20th century music. Alban Berg was the composer of 20th century operas Wozzeck and Lulu, and that very intense musical style is an inspiration for the horror convention. So, of course, the modern horror soundtracks, the entire vernacular of horror, with clusters, aleatoric techniques, tremolos, layered dissonant textures, essentially kind of a wall of sound approach where you have layered dissonances, and I'll go into detail later. Rhythmic ostinatos and soaring melodic lines. These are all the tropes of horror scoring that were employed in the Gothic score for Bloodborne. One nice image to kind of inspire you. And one more. I would like to go into greater detail and talk about the main title, Omen, which was used in the E3 trailer. It's also the opening track on the soundtrack. It's composed by Ryan Ammon. It features a dark, low cello solo in C minor with a three-note motif. The three-note motif sounds melancholy and desolate. This is the cello motif, and you'll hear it. After this cello theme, we hear a signature pounding stab. It's played by a South American instrument called berimbau. It plays a repeated low C pounded, and that's a fresh color that Ryan Ammon brought because he also has researched the South American music very extensively and has traveled. So that's the picture of this instrument, berimbau, and you strike it, and it's doubled with contrabasses and timpani. After that stab, another signature color comes in. It's a cluster in the women's choir, very specific cluster, very dissonant. Later on, the same cello motif is sung by the soprano soloist, first softly and then an octave higher, more loudly. I would like to play this music now, so listen to it. Enjoy. We recorded the strings in two separate passes, also known as striping. All the melodic lines were recorded in one separate pass, and then all the rhythmic ostinatos were recorded as a second pass. This approach gives us more precision in the mixing and also gives us much more flexibility in implementation. Also, because it's a horror game, with heavy sound design, very elaborate sound design, weapons, and Foley, the low brass is reinforced with contrabass trombone and cimbasso in order to balance the heavy low end in the sonic spectrum. This approach of beefing up the low strings and low brass is actually a very typical approach in orchestrating fantasy, horror, and science fiction games and Hollywood movies. For the purpose of maximizing our time at the scoring sessions, at Air Studios, which is obviously very expensive, we made a strategic choice to keep all the orchestral effects on samples. And by orchestral effects, I mean clusters, aleatoric textures, stabs. Usually, there's a sample library called Symphobia. Raise your hand if you're using Symphobia in any of your music. It's the kind of library that you use for sound effects for genre films. So we made a choice to keep these elements on samples, not to recreate them again, because they're already mixed and treated. But I just want to tell you, you could also make a choice to re-record them. For instance, you can re-record the risers. Again, that's a choice you make as a creative artist, as a composer, as a music producer. It can go either way. One more nice image that we saw before. I wanted to talk about the characteristics of the choir, because the choir is obviously a very big part of this sound. It's extremely important. The choral writing is some of the most technically and dramatically challenging writing that I've laid my eyes in recent scores. The choir is unrelentingly dissonant, has a very broad emotional palette. It's somber, soaring, nightmarish, tormented, very often very loud. The choir becomes the signature of the battles with the monstrous bosses. Yet each boss has its own musical personality. The singers are asked to sing in extreme ranges, highest notes for the women, lowest and highest notes for men. They also sing effects, clusters, slides, monastic chants, murmurs. The 32-person choir sings not only conventional 4-note chords, 1 note for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, but is also divided in up to 8 voices. So I wanted to take a close look at 2 level play and what the music that goes for it. So I'm going to look at Ebriedes, one of my favorite pieces. It's composed by Yuka Kitamura, and Ebriedes is a hard-to-beat boss. Pete has beaten her twice, but she beats me every time. So she can be found in the upper cathedral ward. She's a giant, monstrous creature with squid-like tentacles in her back. She's a celestial child, has a set of skeletal wings, and is the conduit between the church and the great bosses. She resembles Cthulhu and is inspired by the cosmic mythology of H.P. Lovecraft. So the piece that accompanies that level has very distinctive features. Through composed form means that unlike, for instance, in a pop song where you have verse, chorus, bridge, in a through composed form you have different sections that flow into each other, and nothing is reprised, nothing returns. Like you don't have a motif that keeps coming back, but everything is kind of new. That's through composed form. And the reason why most of the music is in through composed form throughout the game is because different sections are looped, so you'll get to hear them again and again. The choir is very prominent. It's the kind of choir you'll hear in Requiem or Oratorio, kind of very loud, dramatic. The harmonies are very dissonant throughout, and I'll discuss in detail. The harmonic language starts from tonal, then goes through modal, incorporating modal chords, modality as in Lydian or Phrygian or Mixolydian. There are also polychords. Now, polychords are harmonies stacked together like you would stack Legos. So you're stacking chords and the sound becomes rich and dissonant and very intense. There's also even impressionist harmony. The impressionistic harmony is what Debussy would use in his music. Debussy, of course, is the composer of Clair de Lune and 3 Nocturnes, great impressionist composer. Expressionist harmony, that's the early 20th century harmony that Schoenberg, Albanberg used in their music. And what is interesting about that expressionist harmony is these interlocking sevenths, which I'm going to look in just one second. And finally, the piece has many climaxes throughout. I mean, it kind of goes to a climax, then sustains the level, goes to even higher climax. That's also typical. I wanted to take a close look at the harmony, and I wanted to encourage all composers in this room to do similar exercises because I have found this to be exceptionally useful and powerful. So what I wanted to point out here, this is an excerpt from one of the climaxes in the piece at 2 minutes and 14 seconds. And what you have here is you have these interlocking sevenths. Like if you, for a moment, focus on the mezzo-soprano, that's the second line, the second bar, you have that D against D sharp, diminished octave, minor seventh. And if you just keep looking at... That's the harmony with interlocking sevenths. I'm only showing you the choir, but the orchestral texture also has a lot of sevenths embedded in it. And you see how, in this particular case, you have E against F natural, and again E against F natural, and the D against D sharp. So that's how the harmony was conceived to be dissonant. As my friend Jim says, it's not like, you're mashing the keys with your elbow. This is more elevated approach to dissonance. I also enjoy. This is one thing I enjoy doing as a composer and orchestrator. I'm always very aware of the form, and what I did here is I took the piece as it is in the soundtrack, not in gameplay, because in gameplay it's implemented with looping different sections. And I kind of made this flow chart. It's one continuous line, but I had to fit it in two split lines. So what I did here is indicate the different sections, different thematic sections. Each one has tonal centers. So the music is never totally atonal. It's never quite atonal. It's very dissonant, very kind of wall of sound with stacked dissonances, but there is a clear tonal center. And this is the kind of chart I enjoy doing. It teaches me about the form. I would encourage you to do that. It really is very informative when you want to learn the form of a musical piece. So I'd like to play the gameplay, and again, keep in mind the music has been looped. Obviously, the game plays much longer than 3 minutes. Enjoy. Gameplay continues. My next example is a piece called Watchdog of the Old Lords. That's the name of the gameplay. And in the soundtrack, it's called Terror by Chris Velasco. Oh, the warm and fuzzy cutie. So in the soundtrack, this theme is used for the Chalice dungeon bosses. Now, what's interesting how this piece was implemented. So, for instance, the track as it was composed and as it's in the soundtrack opens with, composed by Chris Velasco, it opens with a 4-note violin gesture. Da, 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 da. And then there's this rhythmic riff, da-da-dum, which becomes the thematic riff for the rest of the music. Later, the choir comes in and the brass picks up on that rhythmic idea, da-da-dum, And from that figure, the whole riff, the whole memorable riff is derived. But the way the music was implemented is actually the gameplay begins with that memorable riff, which actually you're going to see here. That's the brass, dun, da, da, dum, and then the choir has sustains, which is something to listen. That's how the gameplay begins. But in the music, as you can see, it's bar 43. Here is another great example of the choir and strings playing a memorable two-note motif with highest intensity in the most extreme high ranges. Look how high the sopranos are. In classical opera since 18th century, a falling motif like this was called the motif of the sigh. And here it's falling and rising and falling again, but that's again the operatic trope where this idea comes from. Throughout the track, these thematic sections are interspersed with clusters, orchestral risers, and choir effects to create an overall feeling of desperation and life and death stakes, which this cue is. Now, the orchestration is not thick at all. It's not thick and busy. It's not like a wall of sound, what we just saw before. Instead, each motif is doubled at 2 octaves, and sometimes these motifs are doubled at 3 octaves, so you have that layer of 3 octaves playing the same motif. They're doubled in choir, violins, and brass, while the rhythmic propulsion, the propulsive pattern, is in low strings. And then we also have impact hits, like low percussive hits, and occasional clusters, high clusters in the violins, which is an orchestral effect. So in this piece, we have such clarity in each layer, each thematic layer, and the clarity in the spectrum of frequencies. Just for a moment thinking, you're going to hear sound effects, you hear music, you have this spectrum of frequencies, but what we have is clarity, and that clarity gives enormous energy and dramatic impact to each layer. And that approach is opposite to what we just heard, which is the wall of sound, in stacked dissonances, in ebriettas. So both these two approaches are wonderful examples of scoring, genre scoring, and let's now listen to the music. In closing, I want to say Bloodborne was one of the happiest collaborations and most challenging musically jobs for me. Teamwork between freelancers such as myself and the wonderful Sony campuses was fantastic. Listening closely to feedback. I had to listen very closely, forget everything I know and listen closely. Asking questions when in doubt, and extreme attention to the workflow were vital. I was getting feedback on the scores from my fantastic supervisors, Peter Scaturro and Keith Leary, and from all 6 composers. The Sony producer, Monty Mudd, was in charge of reviewing the scores and providing feedback as well. Attention to detail, meticulous file archiving, and communication were crucial as finale files, were flying across the globe and across time zones. So working on Bloodborne was one of my proudest accomplishments. And now I will let Jim talk about the orchestration.
Hello. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the music for the DLC, the Old Hunters, and in particular, I'm going to have a look at Tsukasa Saito's cue, The Orphan of Kos. I'm going to touch briefly on the differences between the recording sessions for the main game and for the DLC, and on maintaining the established orchestral sound, before getting into some detail about the way that Saito-san's cue was orchestrated. Now, Penka's already covered the harmonic language of Bloodborne and the way the orchestra was used. So I'm going to look instead at the way the cue appeared in the original MIDI and the way that it was and wasn't changed to create the orchestration for live performance. And then we'll try and squeeze in a summary. Why not? So although the choir and the orchestra were the same size, the number of sessions weren't. So originally we had 8 sessions, that was 27 hours of recording. For the DLC, we just had 2 sessions, one for the orchestra and one for the choir. And overdubbing rules mean that we weren't able to replicate that reinforced orchestra sound that Penka had created to use to create Bloodborne's dense orchestrations. But the music still had to have the same sound as the original score. It had to be a continuation of Bloodborne's story in the same way that the DLC is. So that was the first problem to solve. And the way we decided to go about that was to think about each cue's orchestration's foreground, its middle ground, and its background. So for each cue, there's generally those 3 elements. There's the foreground, which will be melodic, thematic material, or, as is often the case in Bloodborne, it's that kind of driving, riffy, ostinato things. The middle ground is going to be counter melodies, other elements that are of secondary melodic or thematic importance, for instance, accompaniments. And finally, the background, which is harmonic support, effects that fill out the orchestral sound. So to help with the sense of scale, it was important in the Old Hunters music to give each orchestrational element its own space. This allowed it to be played as forcefully as possible without overpowering the other sections. To achieve this, we made sure each element was represented by a distinct section of the orchestra playing in its most effective range, while ensuring that the original orchestral sound envisaged by the composer was retained. So if a foreground element was in the strings, it remained in the strings rather than be moved into the brass, into the choir. So let's have a listen to some of those elements in The Orphan of Kos. And we're going to jump in about halfway through the cue where the large 5/4 ostinato really kicks in. So here, the main point of interest is the ostinato, that kind of driving riffy thing. It's given in the strings, which means that it can be played without breaking for breath, giving the whole music a relentless drive forward, which is further given an uncomfortable off-kilter feel by the 5/4 time signature, so that the whole cue begins to feel quite anxiety-provoking. And it's fairly straightforward. You've got that nice big chunky string thing from an orchestrational standpoint. But if we look at the MIDI provided by Saito-san, we begin to see some problems, some difficulties in directly representing what was written. So this is just a quick snapshot of the piano roll. And you can see there's quite a nice balance spread from high to low. Every little bit's got its own space there. If we just sort of zoom out and look at the tracks, you can see it's actually kind of unbalanced. There's a lot of divisi. Some sections aren't really being used at all. Basses and the first violins, for instance. To just sort of show you that in its MIDI form, to make it vaguely more musical. Here it is pulled into a score. Obviously this is pretty cluttered. I just want you to get a sense of the shape of what's going on there. You can see that the ostinato appears in the cello and the violas in octave divisi, with accents in the basses. And as the phrase progresses, more high strings are added, expanding the octave tutti and growing the sound. It's obviously kind of cluttered, so we'll zoom in a bit on a smaller section, just so it's a bit more obvious what's going on. Cello and violas are covering a 4-octave pattern. The basses have octave unison accents. Everyone's divisi, and they're all sitting in somewhat uncomfortable ranges. The top bass and viola voices are very high, and the low cellos are really about as far as low as they're going to be able to go. This is a common sight when you're orchestrating from MIDI mockups. The composers used their sample libraries in the most effective way to create the sound they want to hear. Here it's the use of viola and cello samples to create a low, full-bodied sound. But if we were to take this as gospel, then the ostinato is going to be very unbalanced. The low cello and high violas in particular won't blend together, and rather than sounding as a solid mass, the sound will be somewhat disjointed. And rather than sounding as solid accents, the bass is going to sound quite strained all the way up there. And I should stress that this isn't a fault in the composition or in the programming. It's just a symptom of making the MIDI mock-up sound as effective as possible. And another thing to bear in mind is that with sampled instrumental sections, when we add another note to the string section, we're essentially adding another 10, 14, 16 players. And that's really beefing up the sound. With real orchestra, of course, when you ask them to divide, you're halving the number of people on each note. Although it can sometimes seem counterintuitive coming from MIDI, divisi can actually make a string section more delicate and airy, especially at low dynamics. Not that that was a thing that happened that much in Bloodborne. So in this situation, the orchestrator needs to rely on their ears as much as on the provided MIDI. The composer's demo is going to be essential in deciding what sound they're after and in helping you decide how to orchestrate for live players. So let's have a listen to a similar section, but this time from the original demo that Tsukasa Saito provided. So that ostinato is in there, and you get the sense that that needs to be aggressive and large and the dominant foreground element of the cue. The lower line may be a bit more prevalent than the upper viola line, at least to begin with. And to get that kind of thick sound, we're going to need the basses, cellos, violas, violins, all in stacked octave unison on the separate lines with undivided sections rather than divisi. And that's going to allow the full force of the players really digging their bows in to add punch and body to the sound. So here's how that final orchestration looked. You see that the second violin stabs have been moved up into the firsts, allowing the seconds to take over the upper viola line when that comes in. And once the idea of the high stabs is established, the firsts are free to move to their original sustained line and join the ostinato at the climax, so that kind of expanding range of the riff is retained as it was originally composed. But of course, by having the basses play the lower voice of the repeated pattern, we've lost the bass stabs, but all is not lost because we had a big brass section to play with. So listening to the brass's role at this point in the cue, you can see they're punctuating that ostinato with really forceful kind of percussive stabs. And that's the middle ground of the orchestration. It's an accompanying figure. It helps to shape the ostinato. And it needs to be perceived by the listener, but it shouldn't dominate the foreground material. The brass as it appeared in the original MIDI looked like this. Not super exciting. Sounds good though. Or in score form, it's here. And you can see that actually only 3 of the trombones have been given anything here. And that's leaving us 8 players with nothing to do. Well, you know, we could bolster that trombone chord. We could put 2 bass trombones on the low E flat. Put 2 tenors on the F, all the horns on the high E flat. We could have the tuba player switch to cimbasso, add an E flat an octave below the bass trombones. That's going to give us a really big, aggressive, in-your-face chord. When it's played at triple F, it's going to be pretty overpowering. but it's going to be too big, right? It'll completely overpower the strings whenever we hear it, and it leaves nowhere for the brass to go as the music builds towards the end of the cue. Not to mention our leftover double bass stabs. And there's that horn effect to consider as well. I mean, we could stick with the samples as Penka suggested, but here, where that sample is repeated several times through the cue, much nicer if we can to get it live with some variations. So the solution here was to treat those two stab motifs, the original trombone part and the original contrabass part, as the middle ground material, and give both to the low brass, so keeping the areas of orchestration in the same section. This connected the two patterns together as a single orchestrational idea and kept them both powerful but still balanced with the strings. It also meant that the horns could play their effect live, adding variety each time you hear it. So there's how that ended up looking. The horn effect makes up part of the background along with the percussion, the timps and cymbals, and the sustained first violins when they appear. And the background fills out the orchestration harmonically. And although part of it is performed by the brass instruments, the horn's different timbre and their different spatialization really delineates it from the low brass accompaniment. And you should be able to make out on that big old screen the accents that have been added to just slightly give a different shape to the two lines. There's tenutos on the tuba and second bass trombone. They're taking the original contrabass line, and there's a marked staccato on the other guys. So to achieve the large sound that Penka had established in the original soundtrack, it was necessary to decode the composer's intentions, converting their MIDI mock-ups into live orchestrations that effectively used the resources available. The aim was always to keep the orchestra sounding vast, and this was generally achieved by making sure instruments were always playing in strong, full-sounding ranges that balanced well with the rest of their section and the orchestra in general. In this way, it was possible for the musicians to play forcefully without fear of becoming unbalanced. The key here when orchestrating is to listen as well as to look. That way you can best represent the composer's intentions, even if that composer is you. And then arrange within reason to achieve the desired sound. There may be some areas where you thin the MIDI out, but you should always be seeking to represent every pitch that the composer wrote, even if some instances of those pitches are dropped for balance, for voice leading. Although in Bloodborne, this generally meant keeping orchestrational ideas within instrumental families, it was still important to think about the orchestra and orchestration as a whole. A change made in the strings may leave some musical material that needs to be covered by the brass, but that may leave the existing brass passages understaffed. The choir could add body to a high string line, but is that going to diminish their impact when they enter later in the cue? By having a view of the whole cue at all times, both horizontally and vertically, you can be aware of how arrangements in one family or passage are affecting another. I guess what I'm getting at is that although it's helpful to think by family and in terms of foreground, middle ground, and background, ultimately the orchestra is a single sound-making entity. It's a single instrument, and you get the most out of it if you think of it as a whole, rather than as a selection of ensembles that come together to perform a cue. So taking a MIDI orchestration that sounds great and converting it into a score playable by an orchestra which matches that sound is a common task for orchestrators. Hopefully, by looking briefly at a section of how the Orphan of Kos was orchestrated, how it originally arrived as MIDI, and what the thought processes were in going from one to the other, you have some ideas for the next time you're orchestrating your own or another composer's music. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand you back to Pete.
So folks, just a few final words. As I mentioned earlier, we started this project with the intention of just providing some music for an E3 trailer, but it really wound up growing organically as we continued our discussions and our work with our colleagues in Japan. Eventually, as I said in the beginning, the production was really spread out over the 3 continents. And this had a very interesting effect when it came to the crunch, because we had a couple of crunches, one with the game score and also with the DLC. And that is that Jim could be working in the UK and we could take advantage of the time difference. So he could work all day, send us some stuff. The J Studio folks, of course, were ahead, I think 17 hours, 16, 17 hours from us in the U.S. So, sort of you think about it as far as, managing the workflow from region to region, it was actually something that worked quite well and made the crunch much more manageable than it sometimes is, as I'm sure many of you know. When you do a project like this, communication is really the key. And it really helps. There was there's an unsung hero, I think, in this whole collaboration, and that was, in this case, June Mickey, who was our business development manager for Sony Japan Studio. And June was tasked with not only doing the translation with us, but she really helped us with it's sort of her role in this was much more nuanced and subtle, because it's not about just translating what you're saying, but it's also the cultural nuances and really trying to express, particularly with music, where language sometimes is very difficult for us to use. We don't have the words in our language to really express what we want emotionally out of music. So she was really crucial to making this collaboration happen and be smooth. Also, I have to say, well, here, I'm going to end with this picture. So this just shows some of our team when we were recording the DLC and recording the main game score, and that's some of us at Abbey Road. Of course, there were a lot more people involved than just what you see on the screen there, and really want to thank those Miyazaki-san and the From composers. They were absolutely brilliant. There's all of our colleagues at J Studio, particularly Kei Isamu from the audio department at J Studios, Alan Becker, who is the director of Japan Studio, was very supportive. Of course, the producers for Bloodborne, in particular Toriyama-san and Masaaki. And just really appreciate their help and support with this. So I'm going to end with just one final thought, and that is that something happened in this production that was really profound. And we're working on the music, but there was, and forgive me if I bust a feeling here, but there was something bigger that happened, and you really start to see the effect of music. What are we doing here? It's not about the notes after a certain point. It's about the communication. It's about the relationships that we're able to forge. And you particularly notice this when there is a language barrier between yourselves and the other members of your production team. And this is the thing that winds up binding us and really make this a fulfilling thing to do. So I just want to leave you with that thought. We have some time for a few questions. So I guess we'll open it up to the floor. If anyone wants to ask us a question, please raise your hand. Or if there's a mic. Oh, there is a mic.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really informative. I have a quick question for Penka. I noticed on one of the formal examples that you gave that you noted that Lydian mode was used. And were there other modes besides Lydian that found their place in the music in particular?
The only cue that used modes extensively was Ebrietas. All the other cues used Phrygian and minor, like typical genre scoring.
Great, thank you.
Hi guys, and gal. First of all, I want to say thanks to Penka and Jim for really getting into some nuts and bolts stuff with the music. It's, it can be a little rare sometimes that people are, willing to talk about things like Divisi and Fortissimo for fear of alienating people. So it's nice to hear, the real musical language. But this question is actually more for Pete, I think. So this was a really big project, obviously. Multiple continents, multiple studios, and highly anticipated. So there's sort of a guarantee that it'll sell really well, right? Hopefully, fingers crossed. But I'm guessing that at some point during the production, you maybe hit that ceiling of what you thought the original budget would be, and had to go to somebody and say, "Hey, we're short," or "We need more money." And I'm curious when or if that conversation has happened on this game or another game. How do you convince somebody that is going to write the check that, look, it's really, really important that we do this to the best of our abilities and not compromise, you know, with the full scope that we originally set out to, you know, complete?
You know, that's a really good question. So let me give you some insight to that. One, I should say that when it comes to managing a production budget for music, that is something that is quite manageable, and we found that it's easy. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but it's very possible to stick within the scope that you originally set out, the money that you have available, what you want to accomplish with that. What is, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but what's a little bit more difficult to manage in terms of budget sometimes has to do when your work, we're doing implementation work, for example, and it's dependent on the performance of other aspects of the development team. Mm-hmm. That's when the labor there can sometimes be an unknown. But managing the external budget is what we call, it's fairly straightforward. Now, that's not to say that the scenario that you're describing doesn't happen, because it does. However, it's usually not something that we get blindsided by. Mm. So we are, of course, in communication all the time with the other producers that are on a game. So when it comes to decisions that might be made in terms of quality or expanding the number of minutes of music that we're going to produce for the game, that's something that usually has some lead up to a major decision. That major decision maybe being, hey, we want to spend some more money because we know we're going to get this benefit.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I actually had two questions for Penka. The first of which was for Briatus. I found it super interesting that you put in Lydian in the middle because it's a horror soundtrack. It's supposed to be so dark and foreboding, but Lydian, personally, I feel it's one of like the most kind of happier, beautiful kind of a scale. So I was wondering what was your thought process when you decided, okay, this section is going to have the Lydian modal scale in it?
But you have to remember, my job was to translate the composer's vision, so I kept all the notes. But also remember, who is this boss? So she's like a celestial child, so it's okay to have that very cosmic sound. So I haven't changed any notes. I did have to do some refinement of the arrangement, but my job was to translate the vision. So it totally worked for me because I thought of her, well, this is like the cosmic, you know, the H.P. Lovecraft ideas. And Lydian, but you also have the low bass, so it's Lydian plus something else going on that's very dissonant.
Okay. Also, sorry, just one more question. Perhaps for all three of you, do you have any composers that you would suggest to study for this kind of grand scale of orchestration with the horror, like dissonant feel?
Bram Stoker's Dracula, the soundtrack. Expression.
Kilar, right?
Yeah, Wojciech Kilar. 20th century music, Strauss, Richard Strauss, Schoenberg, Albanberg, horror soundtracks. There's a fantastic vernacular of sci-fi horror music out there of 21st century, 20th century. I would encourage you strongly to study soundtracks, and if you can lay your hands on scores and dissect the scores the way Jim and I did today, it will be tremendously beneficial. I strongly encourage that.
They're not horror, but as you say, Richard Strauss and Wagner, you can't go wrong studying them for orchestration.
Thank you so much.
What are some of the challenges that maybe you face working doing orchestration for 6 different composers? Because I do a little orchestration, and everyone I've worked with has a totally different approach, and it kind of changes my workflow. So maybe you two could talk a little about that.
I was brought in very early. We had a number of conversations with Pete and Keith, and I understood my job was to unify the vision. That was my primary job, and it took certain questions and addressing things and refining, but I had to unify, and through the orchestration, through translating the ideas of the composers, trying to understand the intent as Jim spoke about, understanding the composer's intent. But it was that choice of instruments and like choice of beefing up the low strings or low brass that is part of the horror scoring that added that unified sound. The composers, I was privy to the design sheets, the design documents that were given to the composers and the notes, the feedback that was given. So actually I saw the notes that Miyazaki-san gave to the composers and was able to incorporate that thought process in my orchestration.
To be honest, it was relatively easy for me because Penka had already done all that work.
Thank you.
Hi. What were the compositional and other musical elements in the Cleric Beast theme?
Is that the cleric?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question there?
Sure. No, what were the compositional and other musical elements that defined the sound of the Cleric Beast theme?
Which beast?
Cleric Beasts?
Oh, Cleric Beast. Oh, it's double strings, so short strings and long strings, brass, choir, and orchestral effects that came from the samples.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same orchestration, what you saw here. And the strings were in two passes. You have the melodic strings and you have jang, 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 jang. You have the low strings going on ostinato.
Thanks. Was there a particular rhythmic device or something? It's very intense, and I was just wondering what led to that.
The whole orchestra and strings, two passes, and samples, and percussion.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi guys, great talk. Thanks a lot. I have a quick question for workflow. Penka, basically, did you start working straight under the sequencer software and start maybe removing key switches and doing some cleanups? How did that go about?
Normally, as a matter of routine, I receive MIDI files. Both Jim and I receive MIDI files, which have all the MIDI instruments. And we also receive a full mix and stems, string, brass, effect stems, everything separated so we can hear distinctly. And then we go through our protocol. You know, we have to clean up the MIDI. Our first job is to understand the composer's intention. That's the most important job. So we listen, we recreate the sequence and we listen very closely many times, mute and solo different stems. And once that musical picture is clear in my mind, then I begin orchestrating, begin crafting the score. And then there's like levels of refining, but it's always the MIDI, and as Jim explained brilliantly, the composer gives you the MIDI, but it's our job to translate and refine and polish that MIDI, and most importantly, translate it to this orchestral ensemble. And once you play it on the stage, that same power, that same impact, same orchestral mass has to translate from how the MIDI sounds, and of course has to sound 100 times better. But it's our job to take that composer's vision and translate it for the live performance, for the recording session. To be performed.
Thanks for reminding everybody the importance of the orchestration and the orchestrator's job.
But it's the composer's vision. We just translate it for the orchestra.
Nice.
Our job is to be dutiful and honor the notes. Yeah.
Hi there, great talk. And from designer perspective, I have to ask a question. How many? Composers, how many, what's the stuff they get before like they start to work? If it's like design documents or the concept arts, how many information they get about the boss before they like start to working with?
The question is, what did the composers receive before they composed, correct?
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Concept art, generally. We discussed it. Of course, a lot of that I think was covered at the beginning of the talk in terms of just what the template's going to be. Sometimes, where is this going to appear in the game? They didn't have much, to be honest with you. I have to say the composers did, particularly on the American composers,